The wind howled through the barren landscape, sweeping across the lonely, forgotten house that stood in the middle of nowhere. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the decaying structure. It was the only sign of civilization in an otherwise lifeless expanse. The place had a reputation. Stories of missing travelers, strange noises, and whispers in the dark. Daniel had heard those stories, but he didn't believe in them. He was a rational man, a journalist by profession, always looking for the truth behind urban legends. He had traveled far to reach this forsaken place, determined to uncover whatever secret lay hidden in its decaying walls. His flashlight flickered as he stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the silent darkness. The air was thick with dust and the scent of rot. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling, swaying slightly in the cold breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. The house was bigger than he had imagined, multiple rooms, long corridors, and a spiral staircase leading to an upper floor. Daniel pulled out his camera and started taking pictures, the flash briefly illuminating the gloom. He recorded his voice on a small recorder. "I have entered the house. It appears abandoned, but there are signs of past inhabitants. I see old furniture covered in dust, broken picture frames, and a large, locked door at the end of the hall. I will investigate further." The locked door intrigued him. Unlike the rest of the house, it seemed untouched by time. The wood was smooth, and the brass handle gleamed faintly under his flashlight. He pressed his ear against it, listening, and then he heard it. A whisper. Low, unintelligible, but undeniably real. Daniel's heart pounded. His logical mind told him it was just the wind, but his instincts screamed at him to leave. But he had come too far to back out now. He reached into his bag, pulling out a small crowbar he had brought for such situations. With a grunt, he wedged it between the door and the frame, forcing it open with a sharp creak. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness. His flashlight beam cut through it, revealing a sight that sent chills down his spine. A chair sat in the center of the room, and in it, something was sitting. At first, it looked like a human figure, slouched forward, its head hanging. But as he stepped closer, the details became horrifyingly clear. The figure was massive, much larger than any man, its limbs unnaturally long, its fingers twisted and sharp like claws. Its face was obscured by a thick manet of wild hair, but Daniel could see deep, sunken eyes staring at him from the shadows. And then, it moved. The thing slowly lifted its head, revealing a grotesque face, half human, half something else entirely. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, its mouth stretching into a twisted grin. "You came," it whispered, its voice a mix of human and something far more monstrous. Daniel staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt frozen in place. The creature stood up. It was massive, nearly reaching the ceiling, its long arms hanging unnaturally low. It took a slow step forward, its bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. Daniel turned and bolted. He ran down the corridor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The house suddenly felt alive. Doors creaked open on their own, shadows moved along the walls, whispers filled the air. He stumbled into the main hall, nearly tripping over a broken chair. A sound behind him. Daniel turned, his flashlight shaking. The creature was there, standing in the doorway, watching him. And then, it spoke again. "You are not the first." Daniel's vision blurred with fear. He didn't know what this thing was, but he knew one thing. He had made a terrible mistake coming here. The door to the house was only a few feet away. If he could just make it outside. The creature took another step forward. Daniel turned and ran, his hand reaching for the doorknob. He yanked it open, and the darkness swallowed him whole. The moment Daniel yanked the door open, everything around him shifted. Instead of stepping outside into the cold night, he plunged into absolute darkness, as if he had fallen into a void. His body felt weightless for a moment. Then he hit solid ground with a heavy thud. Pain shot through his side as he gasped for air. His flashlight had slipped from his grasp, rolling away until its beam flickered weakly in the distance. He tried to get up, but the ground beneath him felt strange, not like wood or stone, but something softer, almost alive. Then he heard it, breathing, slow, heavy, raspy. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he reached for his flashlight. His fingers grazed the cold metal, and with a desperate motion, he grabbed it and pointed it in the direction of the sound. The creature was there, but it wasn't just standing anymore. It was crouched low, its massive body hunched in an unnatural position, its long, clawed fingers resting against the ground. Its glowing eyes were locked onto him, unblinking. The grin on its face had stretched wider, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. Daniel scrambled backward, his breath coming in short gasps. What do you want?" he stammered. The creature tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate. "You do not belong here." Daniel's mind raced. Here? Where was here? He had opened the door to leave the house, but he hadn't stepped outside. He had fallen into something else, someplace unnatural. He forced himself to look around. The space was dimly lit, the walls shifting like liquid shadows, as if they weren't made of solid material at all. The air was thick with a heavy, suffocating presence, and strange whispers slithered through the darkness like unseen voices murmuring just out of reach. "Where am I?" he demanded, forcing his fear down. The creature remained silent for a moment before speaking again. "You stepped through the wrong door." Daniel felt ice crawl up his spine. The wrong door? The stories about this house had always mentioned disappearances. People would enter, but they would never leave. Had they all fallen into this place? His grip tightened on the flashlight. "Then let me out," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The creature exhaled, a deep, rumbling sound. "There is no out." Daniel shook his head. "That's not true. There has to be a way." The creature's grin twitched. "You can run, if you like, but you will only find more of us." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. More of them? Suddenly, the whispers in the air grew louder, overlapping into an eerie symphony of hushed voices. The darkness around him shifted, and Daniel realized he was not alone. Shapes began to emerge from the shadows. Figures, dozens of them. Their forms were twisted, elongated, some crawling on all fours, others standing with grotesque, unnatural postures. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, locked onto him with silent, predatory focus. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a haunted house. This was something far worse. He bolted. His legs moved before his mind could fully process it. He sprinted forward, dodging past the shifting figures, his flashlight swinging wildly as he ran. The whispers followed him, growing more urgent, more excited. The ground beneath him felt unsteady, like he was running on something that pulsed beneath his feet. He didn't dare look down. A shape lunged at him from the side. Daniel twisted just in time, barely dodging the clawed hand that swiped at his face. He kept running, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know where he was going, but staying still meant death, or worse. Then, up ahead, he saw something. A doorway. Unlike the shifting darkness around him, this door looked solid, real. It stood alone, framed by nothing but empty blackness. Its wood aged and splintered. It looked exactly like the door he had entered before. Hope flared in his chest. He pushed himself harder, his legs burning as he closed the distance. Behind him, the creatures gave chase. He could hear them, claws scraping, bodies moving unnaturally fast, the whispers turning into unearthly screeches. The door was only a few feet away now. Daniel reached out. A hand grabbed his ankle. Cold, bony fingers latched onto him, yanking him backward with terrifying strength. Daniel hit the ground hard, his flashlight tumbling away, its beam spinning wildly in the darkness. He kicked, thrashed, fought against the thing holding him. The creature loomed over him. Its face was inches from his own now, its breath rancid, its eyes burning with something ancient and hungry. "You cannot leave." Daniel gritted his teeth. He refused to die here. With all his strength, he twisted and slammed his fist into the creature's face. It barely flinched, but the slight hesitation was enough. He wrenched his leg free and scrambled forward. The door. He dove for it, his fingers wrapped around the handle. A scream echoed behind him, inhuman and furious. Daniel yanked the door open. Light flooded his vision. And then, silence. Daniel gasped, his body collapsing onto hard wooden floorboards. He blinked rapidly, his vision adjusting. He was back. The house. The real house. His flashlight was still in his hand, its beam illuminating the familiar decayed walls. The door behind him was gone, replaced by a solid, unbroken wall. Had it been real? Had he truly been trapped in that place? His breathing slowed, his mind racing. Then he noticed something. His ankle. There were deep, bruising marks, fingerprints. Daniel swallowed hard. It had been real. And if that was true, he wasn't alone anymore. Somewhere in the darkness, something was still watching him. To be continued in Part 3. Daniel sat on the dusty floor, his breath ragged, his body trembling from the nightmare he had just escaped. His hands clutched his bruised ankle, the mark of the creature's grip still fresh on his skin. He was back in the house. But was he really safe? The air around him felt different, thicker, almost alive. The silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, oppressive. Slowly, Daniel pushed himself up, gripping his flashlight tightly. The door that had led him into that dark dimension was now gone, just a blank, solid wall. Had it truly been real? Or had he imagined everything? A low creak echoed from behind him. Daniel froze. The house was supposed to be abandoned. But that sound, it wasn't from the wind. It was the sound of weight shifting against old wooden planks. He wasn't alone. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating the decayed walls, the broken furniture, and then a shadow moved. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. The shadow wasn't cast by his flashlight. It moved against the light, shifting unnaturally across the walls, as if it had a mind of its own. Then it spoke. "You left the door open." A chill shot down Daniel's spine. The voice was deep, layered, as if multiple beings were speaking at once. It wasn't human. It was them. His grip on the flashlight tightened. "No, I shut it. I escaped." A low, guttural chuckle filled the air. The shadow twisted, growing taller, stretching unnaturally across the ceiling and walls. "Escape? No, Daniel. You brought us here." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The door, when he had escaped, he had pulled it open. But what if, in doing so, he had also let something out? His stomach churned. He had made a terrible mistake. The house suddenly groaned, as if something massive was shifting within its walls. The temperature dropped drastically, his breath now visible in the cold, stale air. Then the whispering began, not just from one direction, but from everywhere. Soft, eerie voices slithered through the darkness, speaking in a language Daniel didn't understand. Some were close, others distant, but they all carried the same message. He wasn't supposed to leave. His instincts screamed at him to run. But where? The exit. The front door. If he could just make it outside. A loud thud shook the house. Daniel staggered backward as something moved in the darkness. He lifted his flashlight, but this time, the light didn't penetrate the shadows. Instead, the darkness swallowed it, rendering it useless. Something was coming, and it was no longer just a whisper. A low growl rumbled through the air. Heavy, slow footsteps echoed down the hall. Then, silence. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He took a cautious step forward, his hand reaching for the wall to steady himself. A hand grabbed his wrist. Cold, bony, wrong. Daniel screamed, yanking his arm away, stumbling backward. The thing in the dark moved fast, too fast. It lunged. He barely dodged. His foot caught on broken wood, and he hit the ground hard. Pain exploded through his ribs, but he didn't have time to react. The thing loomed over him, its grotesque form shifting, its glowing eyes staring hungrily. "You let us in." Its voice was a rasping whisper, thick with something ancient and malicious. Daniel kicked out, scrambling to his feet. He ran, through the hole, past broken furniture, dodging the grasping shadows that clawed at his clothes. The whispers turned into screeches, angry and desperate. The exit, he could see it. The front door, slightly ajar, moonlight spilling through the gap. He didn't hesitate. He sprinted, throwing himself forward. Something slammed into him from behind. A crushing weight pinned him to the ground. Long, jagged fingers wrapped around his throat. "Stay." Daniel's vision blurred. He struggled, gasping for air, his hands clawing at the thing's grip. His lungs burned. No, he would not die here. With the last of his strength, he reached into his pocket, his lighter. With trembling fingers, he flicked it on. A small flame burst to life. The creature recoiled. For the first time, it hesitated. Its grip loosened. Daniel didn't waste the opportunity. He shoved the lighter toward its face. A shriek, louder than anything he had ever heard. The creature reeled back, its body twisting in agony as the flame's glow touched it. Daniel didn't look back. He bolted through the open door, diving into the cold night air. The moment he crossed the threshold, everything went silent. No more whispers, no more screeches, just the sound of the wind howling through the empty landscape. Daniel collapsed onto the dirt, gasping, his body shaking violently. He turned back toward the house. The door was gone. Just like before, the entrance was sealed, as if it had never been opened. Had he truly escaped? Or had they simply let him go? He would never know. But one thing was certain. The door had opened once, and it could open again. The end.